The alarm did not wail. It simply appeared, a red pulse across every screen on the bridge, and that silence was worse than any siren could have been. I was Commander Edward Hall, and I had spent 6 years hauling grain, machine parts, and medical supplies across the quiet corners of known space. Nothing about that morning felt quiet. "Signal incoming," said Laura Bennett, my communications officer, her voice flat, the way it always got when something was wrong. "Encrypted distress call. Source unknown. It's routed through 4 relay stations just to reach us." 4 relays means someone is desperate, I said. "Put it through." The voice that came out of the speaker was not human. It was thin, stretched, and trembling in a way that told me the translation software was struggling to keep up with panic. A being called itself Ambassador Yil Thara, speaking for a coalition called the Vel Concord. Their words tumbled over each other. "Any vessel receiving this signal, please respond. Our home system of Doran's Reach is under approach by hostile forces. We have no military capability to resist. We call upon any allied or neutral fleet within range. Please, we are not a warlike people. We ask only for protection." I looked at my crew. Peter Whitfield, my second-in-command, had gone very still at his station, the way he did when he was doing math in his head instead of talking. Grace Turner, our navigator, had already pulled up star charts before I even gave the order. "Range to Doran's Reach?" I asked. 11 hours at standard cruise," Grace said. 6, if we push the engines past regulation. 6 hours. That was fast for us, but slow for whatever was already bearing down on that system. I thought about our escort, 2 aging gunships, a repair vessel, and 11 cargo haulers converted decades ago from mining rigs. We were not a fleet built for confrontation. We were built to survive the long haul between hostile stretches of space, patched and reinforced 100 times over by crews who never expected glory, only another safe delivery. "Sir," Peter said carefully, "we are a supply convoy. We don't have combat-rated ships beyond the 2 escorts. If this is a real military threat, we are not the answer to their prayers." "Maybe not the answer they wanted," I said, "but we're the answer they got." Laura patched through more of the ambassador's transmission. Sensor logs came with it, grainy and distorted from the long relay chain, but clear enough. A fleet was approaching Doran's Reach, not a small raiding party. Formation ships, at least 30 of them, moving with the practiced precision of a species that had conquered territory before and intended to do it again. "Do we know who they are?" I asked. Grace ran the visual signature against our database. It took a moment before her face changed, the color draining slightly from her cheeks. "Vrekthi," she said. "Border Enforcement Classification. They don't send this many ships unless they intend to occupy, not negotiate." The bridge went quiet again. Everyone on my crew had heard of the Vrekthi, not from first-hand encounters. Most of us hadn't been unlucky enough for that, but from the stories that moved along trade routes, the way ghost stories move around campfires. A species that expanded not through diplomacy, but through overwhelming presence, taking systems the way a tide takes a beach, slow and certain and impossible to argue with. "They picked a coalition with no military," Peter said quietly. "Easy targets." "They didn't expect anyone would come," I said. "That's usually how it works out here. Most fleets stay in their lane. Most captains look at odds like this and keep flying past." "We're not most captains," Laura said, and there was something in her voice, not quite a question, more like she was reminding herself. I want to explain something here, because it matters for everything that happened after. Humanity does not have a reputation out among the stars for being gentle. We don't have a reputation for being especially advanced either, not in the way some species measure it, with sleek ships and elegant technology. What we have is a reputation for being difficult to kill, and for treating difficulty as something almost personal. Our homeworld did not go easy on us. Every one of my crew had grown up hearing stories about ancestors who survived things that should not have been survivable, not through some special gift, but through stubbornness passed down like a family heirloom. When other species look at humans, there is a particular kind of caution in their eyes, the kind you give something you don't fully understand and would rather not test. I didn't think of myself as fitting that reputation. I thought of myself as a man who moved cargo and tried to get his crew home in one piece. But reputations don't ask for your opinion before they follow you around. Options, I said, turning to my crew, because that's what you do when the weight of a decision needs more than one set of shoulders under it. We could reroute, Peter offered, though I could tell even as he said it that he didn't believe it was the right answer. Send the distress signal onward to a proper defense fleet. Let someone better equipped handle it. By the time a proper fleet gets the message and responds, that system will already belong to someone else, Grace said. The math doesn't work. We're the only ones close enough. So it's us, I said, or it's nobody. Laura had been quiet, listening to the ambassador's voice, which was still transmitting, pleading into the void without knowing whether anyone capable of helping was even listening. When she looked up, her jaw was set in a way I recognized. There's a version of this where we say it's not our fight, she said. There's also a version where we live with knowing we could have done something. I made my decision the way I always did, quickly, because hesitation costs more than mistakes do out in open space. Set course for Doran's Reach, I said. Full engines, wake every off-shift crew member and get them briefed. We are not a warship, but we are what showed up, and that has to count for something. Ambassador Yil Thara's voice crackled through the speaker one more time, catching the tail end of my order through the open channel. You are responding? The voice asked, disbelief threading through the translation. You are human? We are, I said. We'll be there in 6 hours. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. When the ambassador spoke again, the words came slower, more careful, as if measuring something they had only heard about in old reports and rumors. We had hoped for a fleet, Yil Thara said. We did not expect this. No one ever does, I said, and I meant it as reassurance, though I would learn later that it landed very differently on the other end of that call. Grace pushed the engines past every safety threshold we had on record, and the ship groaned around us the way old machines do when you ask more of them than they were built to give. Peter moved through the convoy channel, briefing the other ship captains, and I could hear the tension rising in different voices as the reality of where we were headed settled over each crew. I walked the corridors while we burned toward Doran's Reach, checking on my people the way I always did before anything uncertain. I found young engineers running diagnostics they'd already run twice, not because the numbers needed checking again, but because their hands needed something to do. I found older crew members, the ones who had been with me the longest, moving with a calm that unsettled the newer faces around them, not because they weren't afraid, but because fear had long since become something they knew how to carry without dropping. It is also no time at all when the other side of that decision is already moving toward a system full of people who have never had to defend themselves. When Doran's Reach finally came into view on our long-range sensors, I saw the shape of what we were walking into for the first time in full detail. A single moon-based colony, agricultural fields stretching under artificial light, transport routes built for trade rather than defense, and above it all, the growing silhouette of a fleet that had not yet realized what kind of help had answered the call they never expected anyone to hear. I sat in my chair, hands steady on the arms of it, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and all the ways it had to go right anyway. Bring us in, I said. Let's go meet the people we came to help. None of us knew yet how the next few days would be remembered, or how far the story would travel once it was over. All we knew, in that moment, was that somewhere ahead of us, a system full of frightened people was waiting for anyone at all to show up, and we intended to be more than anyone had bargained for. The colony's orbital platform came into full view as we dropped out of high-speed travel, and I watched the faces of my bridge crew as they took in what waited for us. Doran's Reach was beautiful in the way that undefended places often are, open and trusting, with transport ships still moving between farming stations, as if the danger heading their way was something that could be negotiated with, rather than something that simply took what it wanted. A smaller vessel broke away from the platform and approached us, moving with the careful hesitation of someone unsure whether they were about to be rescued or simply replaced by a different kind of danger. Laura opened the channel, and the same voice from before filled the bridge. Ambassador Yil Thara, though now I could see the being attached to it on our view screen for the first time. Yil Thara had a narrow frame, pale gray skin, and large dark eyes that seemed built for reading emotion rather than concealing it. Every member of the Concord I would meet over the following hours had that same quality, faces that hid nothing, because their culture had apparently never needed to teach them how. The ambassador's eyes moved across our ship on the display, taking in the dents along our hull, the mismatched plating where repairs had been welded on over the years, the cargo bay doors that had clearly never been designed with a battle in mind. "This is your response fleet?" Thara asked, and I heard something crack slightly in that careful diplomatic voice. "This is my convoy," I said. "Escort ships, cargo haulers, and one repair vessel that has kept us alive longer than it probably should have. We do not mean to offend," the ambassador said quickly, "but we had expected more." Peter shifted beside me, and I caught the look he gave, the kind that said he understood exactly why the ambassador felt that way, because looking at our ships from the outside, it was hard to imagine them standing against 30 organized warships. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice even, "but looks aren't always where the truth lives. Tell me about the fleet approaching your system. How much time do we have?" Thara pulled up a display, and the numbers were worse than I had hoped. The Vrekthi fleet had slowed their approach only slightly, still cutting through open space with the confidence of a force that had never once needed to hurry. "Perhaps 8 hours until they reach orbital range," the ambassador said. "We have evacuated what civilians we can to the far side of the moon, but there are still workers in the agricultural stations who cannot be moved in time." "Then we don't have 8 hours," I said. "We have less than that, because we need time to prepare before they arrive, not just react when they do." I gave the order to bring the convoy into a defensive formation around the colony, positioning our 2 gunships at forward points and spreading the cargo haulers wide enough to create the illusion of a larger presence, though I doubted that illusion would hold up under any real scrutiny. My repair vessel, an old workhorse named the Camden, began running lines to reinforce shield generators on our escorts, borrowing power reserves from the cargo ships that weren't going to need them for combat anyway. Grace worked alongside 2 of the Concord's own technicians, comparing our sensor data with theirs, building a clearer picture of what was actually heading toward us. The Vrekthi ships moved in tight, disciplined lines, each one carrying weapon signatures that our systems flagged as significant but not unfamiliar. That detail mattered more than it seemed at first. Familiar meant we had faced similar systems before, in smaller skirmishes along contested trade lanes, and familiar meant we had learned things about them that they likely did not know we had learned. "Commander," Grace said, looking up from her console, "their formation is built for overwhelming a target quickly. It's not designed for a drawn-out fight. It's designed to make resistance feel pointless before it even starts." "That's not just a tactic," I said. "That's a message. They want anyone watching to give up before the first shot is fired." "Will it work?" she asked, and there was no doubt in her voice, only curiosity, the kind that comes from trusting the answer before it's given. "Not on us," I said. I walked through the ship while final preparations continued, checking each station personally. On the lower deck, I found Charlotte Wells, one of our younger engineers, adjusting a cluster of makeshift shield boosters that had been assembled from spare cargo hauling equipment. It wasn't elegant work, but it was clever, the kind of improvisation that came from years of having to make do with less than the job required. "Think it'll hold?" I asked her. "It'll hold long enough," she said, not looking up from her work. "Long enough is usually all we get anyway." Further along, I found Henry Marsh, one of our gunship pilots, sitting quietly in the small mess hall, eating a meal like it was any other day, though his hands moved with slightly more precision than usual, the only sign that he understood exactly what was coming. "You good?" I asked. "Been worse," he said simply, and I believed him, because I had flown with Henry long enough to know that when he said things were fine, they generally were, or he'd already decided they were going to be. By the time I returned to the bridge, the Concorde had sent over a small delegation to observe our preparations directly, standing at the edge of the bridge with expressions that shifted between confusion and something close to alarm. Thara stood among them, watching my crew move through final checks with a kind of calm that clearly did not match what the ambassador expected from a species about to face overwhelming odds. Your crew does not seem afraid, Yale Thara observed quietly, almost to themselves. We're afraid, I said, overhearing. We're just not new to it. The ambassador studied me for a long moment. Our reports on your species describe you as unpredictable, difficult to categorize. I did not understand what that meant until now. It usually just means we don't quit when the odds say we should, I said. That tends to confuse people. Our long-range sensors picked up the first sign of contact less than 2 hours later. Not the main fleet itself, but a single scout vessel, small and fast, sent ahead to confirm what kind of resistance, if any, waited at Doran's reach. It moved with the casual confidence of something that expected to find nothing worth reporting. Should we hail it? Laura asked. No, I said. Let's see what it does first. The scout ship closed distance quickly, sweeping past the outer edge of our formation, clearly expecting to catalog a handful of unarmed transport vessels and move on. Instead, its sensors would have picked up shielded gunships holding formation, weapon systems active, and a defensive posture that did not match the profile of a helpless coalition. The scout hesitated, its course shifting slightly, uncertain. They weren't expecting company, Peter said quietly. No, I agreed. They weren't. I gave the order for Henry's gunship to move into an intercept position, not to strike, but simply to be seen, close enough that the scout's sensors could no longer avoid registering exactly what kind of ships had arrived. The scout lingered a moment longer, gathering what data it could, before turning sharply and accelerating back toward the main fleet. On the bridge, the Concord delegates watched the exchange in silence, and I noticed Yale Thara's large eyes had not left the display since the scout appeared. That is all? The ambassador asked. They simply left? For now, I said. They'll report back. Their commanders will decide whether we're worth taking seriously. And if they decide we are not, then they'll be making a mistake, I said, and mistakes like that tend to be expensive. I watched the scout's signature shrink on our display, racing back toward the approaching fleet, carrying with it the first small piece of information that would change how the next several hours unfolded. Somewhere in that fleet, a commander who had expected an easy occupation was about to receive a report that did not match their expectations at all, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what it must feel like to build your entire strategy around a target that refuses to behave the way you assumed it would. Grace broke the quiet a few minutes later. Commander, the main fleet has changed course slightly. Not retreating, repositioning. They're recalculating, I said. That's what happens when the picture doesn't match the plan. Peter looked over at me, and for the first time since we'd left our original route, I saw something steady settle into his expression. The kind of resolve that comes not from certainty of victory, but from the decision to see things through regardless. They're still coming, he said. Of course they are, I said. But now they know it isn't going to be easy, and that changes everything about how this plays out. The moment a predator hesitates, even for a second, the fight is already different than it was before. Outside our viewport, Doran's Reach continued to spin quietly in the light of its distant sun, farmland and colony lights glowing steady against the dark, unaware of how close the next few hours would come to erasing all of it. My crew moved through their final preparations with quiet focus, the kind that doesn't need speeches or reassurances, only the shared understanding that we had already made our decision the moment we changed course, and there was no version of this story where we changed it back. The Vrekthi fleet grew larger on our long-range display with every passing minute, no longer content to simply approach, but now clearly reorganizing into something more deliberate, more careful, a formation that suggested they had, for the first time, begun asking themselves who exactly they were about to face. I intended to make sure they found out the hard way. The next hour passed, the way most of the worst hours in space tend to pass, slowly, with everyone on the bridge finding small tasks to keep their hands busy, while the real waiting happened somewhere behind their eyes. Grace tracked the Vrekthi fleet's movements in careful detail, calling out shifts in their formation as they occurred, and each shift told its own small story about a command structure trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. They've slowed again, she said. Not by much, just enough to suggest hesitation. Good, I said. Hesitation buys us time, and time is the one thing we can actually use to our advantage. The Vrekthi fleet commander, whose name we would later learn was Drax Solvith, had built a career on rapid, decisive occupations, moving from system to system with the kind of efficient brutality that comes from never having faced meaningful resistance. I did not know this at the time, of course. I only knew what our sensors showed us, and what those sensors showed was a fleet accustomed to easy victories now recalculating its approach, for the first time in what our intelligence briefings suggested was several years. On the other side of that recalculation, inside a command vessel far larger than anything in our convoy, Solveth was receiving the scout's report with a level of irritation that would have been comical if the stakes had been lower. I only learned the details of this exchange much later, pieced together from captured logs and translated communications, but it paints a picture worth telling, because it explains everything that happened afterward. "You are telling me," Solveth said to the returning scout pilot, "that a coalition with no recorded military assets has somehow acquired armed escorts." "Human vessels, Commander," the scout reported. "2 shielded gunships, holding defensive formation. The remainder appear to be cargo-class transports, repurposed." Solveth had heard the word human before, the way most commanders across that region had, in passing reports and cautionary notes buried in the margins of larger strategic briefings. Humanity did not occupy territory the way the Vrekthi did. Humans rarely expanded beyond loosely held trade routes, and their fleets were considered small compared to the great powers of the region. What made other commanders cautious was not the size of human forces, but the accounts, some verified, some dismissed as exaggeration, of engagements where human ships had taken losses that should have ended a battle and had simply kept fighting anyway. "Cargo ships do not concern me," Solveth said. "2 gunships do not concern me. Proceed as planned." It was, by every account I have since read, a reasonable decision based on the information available. It was also the last decision Solveth made without understanding exactly what humanity's reputation actually meant in practice, rather than in rumor. Back on our bridge, Peter had been quietly compiling something of his own, a habit of his that I had come to appreciate over the years. He liked to understand not just what an enemy was doing, but why, and he had pulled together fragments of intelligence on Vrekthi engagement patterns from 3 separate trade route incidents over the past decade. "Commander," he said, "I think I understand their approach now. They expect this to be over quickly because it always has been. Every system they've moved into folded within the first exchange of fire. Their entire military doctrine is built around speed and psychological pressure, not sustained engagement. So they've never actually had to fight a long battle," I said. "Not once, as far as I can find," Peter said. "Every recorded engagement ends in under 20 minutes. I let that sit with me for a moment. A fleet that had never needed endurance was a fleet that had never developed it, and endurance, more than any weapon system, was the one thing my crew had in genuine abundance. We had grown up on a planet that did not hand out easy victories, and every one of us carried some version of that lesson written into how we approached a fight, not through recklessness, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that a battle was decided just because the early moments looked bad. "Then we don't give them the fast fight they're expecting," I said. "We give them something they've never trained for." Yil Thara, still standing quietly at the edge of the bridge with the rest of the Concord delegation, had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity. "You believe you can outlast them," the ambassador said. It wasn't quite a question. "I believe outlasting things is what we're good at," I said. "It's not glamorous. It's not always fast, but it works more often than people expect." "There are stories," Yel Thara said carefully, "among older trade communities about your kind. Encounters from long ago, some perhaps exaggerated with retelling. Ships that should have been destroyed, that instead simply refused the outcome. I confess I did not know how much of it to believe." "Most stories get bigger with distance," I said, "but the core of it is usually true enough. We don't surrender to bad odds easily. Sometimes that's cost us more than it should have. Sometimes it's the only reason we're still here to tell the story at all." The ambassador studied me for a long moment, those large dark eyes carrying something that looked almost like recalculation of their own, The same kind of adjustment I imagined was happening somewhere on Solveth's command vessel, except ours was moving in the opposite direction, from doubt towards something steadier. Grace's voice cut through the quiet. "Commander, fleet is resuming approach speed. They're not slowing anymore. I think they've decided we're not worth the caution." "Then let's make sure that decision costs them," I said. I gave the order to shift our formation once more, pulling the cargo haulers further back toward the colony's orbital platform while our two gunships moved to hold the forward line alongside the Camden, whose reinforced shielding made it more durable than its outdated design suggested. It wasn't a formation built to win an open engagement through firepower. It was built to absorb pressure, to bend without breaking, and to make every exchange more costly than the last, for as long as it took the other side to realize the fight wasn't ending the way they expected. Henry's voice came through the comm from his gunship, steady as always. "Commander, we're in position. Whenever they're ready, so are we." "Copy that," I said. "Remember, this isn't about winning fast, it's about not losing slow." "Understood," he said, and I could hear the small note of dry humor in his voice that told me he wasn't rattled, not yet, maybe not at all. The Vrekthi fleet closed the remaining distance faster than I expected, their formation tightening into the same aggressive posture Peter had described from previous engagements, designed to overwhelm quickly and end resistance before it could organize. 30 ships against our handful felt, in that moment, exactly as uneven as it was, and I would be lying if I said no part of me questioned whether outlasting them was actually possible against numbers like that. But I had learned a long time ago that fear is not the same thing as doubt, and you can carry the first without ever giving in to the second. "Ambassador," I said, without looking away from the display, "I'd recommend your people move to secure quarters. This is about to get difficult to watch." "I would prefer to stay," Yelthara said quietly. "If your people are willing to face this, the least I can do is witness it." I didn't argue. There wasn't time, and something in the ambassador's voice told me the decision mattered more to them than I fully understood yet. The Vrekthi fleet crossed into engagement range, and for a brief, suspended moment, every screen on the bridge went quiet, the calm before every storm I had ever flown into, familiar in a way that almost steadied me rather than the opposite. Solvet's voice came through an open channel then, translated smoothly by our systems, carrying the same dismissive confidence that had defined every previous encounter this fleet had faced. "Unidentified vessels," the voice said, "you are outmatched. Withdraw your positions and this system will be occupied with minimal disruption to its inhabitants." I keyed the channel open, and I chose my words carefully because I understood, even then, that this exchange was not really about negotiation. It was about setting expectations, the same way our earlier scout encounter had. "This is Commander Edward Hall, Human Convoy Escort. We're not withdrawing. This system is under our protection now, and we intend to make that mean something." There was a pause on the other end, longer than the previous exchange with the scout, and I imagined Solveth weighing the strange defiance of a handful of outdated vessels against a fleet of 30 warships, still not fully grasping why the math didn't seem to be landing the way it should. "You will not survive this engagement," Solveth said finally. "Maybe not," I said, "but you're going to remember it either way." The channel closed, and the fleet began its advance in earnest, weapon systems charging with the practiced efficiency of a force expecting a short, decisive engagement. On our display, Grace called out the first wave of incoming fire patterns, and Peter began relaying defensive adjustments to the rest of the convoy, his voice calm despite everything building around us. I looked once more at Yelthara, still standing quietly at the edge of the bridge, watching everything unfold with an expression that had shifted from fear into something closer to disbelief, the particular kind that comes from watching a story you'd only ever heard secondhand suddenly become real in front of you. "Hold formation," I said to my crew, my voice steady, even as the first shots crossed the growing distance between us. "Whatever happens next, we don't fold. Not today. Not for this system, not while we're still able to stand between them, and the people down there who never asked for any of this." The first exchange of fire lit up the space between our two forces, and somewhere in that opening moment, I felt the particular clarity that only comes once a decision has been made, and there is no longer any use second-guessing it. We had come expecting to help. What the Vrekthi fleet had not yet understood was exactly what kind of help had answered that call, and the lesson was about to begin in earnest. Our shields took the first wave without breaking, and I watched the numbers on my display drop steadily rather than collapse all at once, exactly the way Charlotte and her team had designed them to. The Vrekthi ships pressed forward in tight coordination, expecting their opening volley to fracture our formation the way it had fractured every formation before it. Instead, we held. Shields at 82% across the line, Grace reported. Camden's reinforcements are holding steady. Keep them steady, I said. Henry, status. Still here, Henry's voice came back, calm as ever, though I could hear the strain of maneuvering under his words. They're pushing hard on the left flank, trying to split us from the colony platform. Don't let them, I said. Fall back toward the Camden if you need to, but don't let that gap open. Peter had taken over coordination of the cargo haulers, which carried no significant weapons of their own, but had been fitted with enough shield capacity to serve as mobile barriers, absorbing stray fire that might otherwise reach the colony platform behind us. It wasn't a role any of those crews had trained for, but they held their positions without complaint, because that was what the moment required of them. Second wave incoming, Grace called out. They're adjusting angle, trying to find a weak point in our spread. They will, Peter said grimly. Their sensors are good, better than the scout suggested. Then we adjust faster than they can find one, I said. This was the part of any engagement that never made it into the stories people told afterward, the long, grinding middle where nothing looked dramatic, where the outcome was decided not through a single dazzling maneuver but through 1,000 small corrections. Shields redirected a few degrees earlier than the enemy expected, power rerouted a half-second before it was needed, decisions made and remade continuously, under pressure that never let up. My crew moved through it with the kind of steady focus that comes only from having done difficult things before and trusting that doing them again would work the same way. Henry's voice came through again, tighter this time. Taking heavier fire, hull integrity at 70% on my ship. Pull back to secondary position, I said. Let the Camden take some of that weight. On it, he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, in the same dry tone he used for everything. For the record, I did have other plans for today. Complaints go in the report, I said, and I heard something that might have been a laugh crackle faintly through the static of his channel before it cut out. That small exchange mattered more than it might seem. Panic feeds on silence, on crews left alone with only the sound of alarms and their own thoughts. A little humor, even under pressure like that, kept people from sliding into the kind of fear that makes hands shake at the wrong moment. I had learned that lesson a long time ago, in circumstances far worse than this one, and I made sure my crew learned it too. On the bridge, Yil Thara watched the exchange with visible confusion. Your pilot is making jokes, the ambassador said, almost accusatory, as though this behavior violated some unspoken rule about how battles were supposed to be conducted. He's fine, I said. That's just how some of us handle it. During combat. Especially during combat, I said. Fear doesn't go away because you ignore it. It just gets louder. Better to give it somewhere small to go. The Vrekthi fleet, meanwhile, was beginning to encounter a problem their doctrine had never accounted for. Every previous engagement they had fought ended quickly, the initial pressure collapsing their opponent's formation before any real strategy could develop. Here, 20 minutes into the engagement, our formation had bent in places, lost ground in others, but had not broken, and every additional minute the fight continued was a minute their entire approach had never been designed to survive. I imagined, though I could not confirm it until much later, the growing frustration on Solvith's command deck as reports came in describing damage inflicted without the expected collapse following it. Ships that should have withdrawn in disarray were instead repositioning with continued coordination. Crews that should have been overwhelmed were instead adapting. Commander, Grace said, her voice carrying a note of surprise, their formation is starting to loosen. Not from damage. I think they're recalculating strategy mid-engagement. They've never had to do that before, Peter said. This is new territory for them. Then let's make sure it stays uncomfortable, I said. I gave the order to shift our own approach, no longer simply absorbing pressure, but beginning to answer it, directing our remaining weapon systems toward the ships showing the most hesitation in their formation, the ones whose movements had started to reflect uncertainty rather than the disciplined precision they'd opened with. It is a strange thing to watch an enemy's confidence erode in real time through nothing more than sensor data and shifting flight patterns. But that is exactly what began happening as the fight passed the half-hour mark, a length of engagement that Peter's research had suggested this fleet had never before experienced. Their forward line is pulling back, Grace called out. Not retreating yet, repositioning defensively. That's the first defensive posture they've taken all day, I said. Keep the pressure steady, don't overextend, but don't let up either. Henry's gunship, badly strained but still holding, rejoined the main formation alongside the Camden, and together, the three vessels closed a gap that the Vrechthi's left flank had been trying to exploit for the better part of 20 minutes. The maneuver cost us more shield capacity than I liked, but it closed the door on the one approach that had shown any promise for the enemy fleet, and closing that door mattered more than the cost of closing it. "Commander," Laura said suddenly, "I'm picking up a change in their command channel. They're broadcasting something to the full fleet, not to us. Can you translate it?" "Partially," she said. "It sounds like new orders. Defensive consolidation. I think they're pulling their formation tighter, trying to protect their flagship." That detail told me everything I needed to know about how the last 20 minutes had gone from Solveth's perspective. A fleet that pulls inward to protect its command vessel is a fleet that has stopped thinking about winning and started thinking about surviving, and that shift, more than any single exchange of fire, was the moment the entire engagement changed shape. "They're not folding completely," Peter observed, "but they've stopped pressing the attack. This is a fleet trying to figure out how to disengage without it looking like a retreat." "Let them figure it out," I said. "We don't need them destroyed, we need them gone." There is a particular kind of restraint that doesn't get talked about often in stories about battles, the choice to let an opponent leave rather than pursue them past the point where pursuit serves any purpose. My crew understood that instinctively, the same way they understood everything else about enduring difficult things without losing sight of what actually mattered. We hadn't come to Doran's Reach to prove a point through destruction. We had come to protect a system that had nowhere else to turn, and the moment that protection was secured, the fight had already served its purpose. Grace's voice carried the first real note of relief I had heard from her since the engagement began. "Commander, their fleet is breaking formation entirely now. They're withdrawing, not repositioning. This looks like a full retreat." "Confirm it before we celebrate," I said, though I could feel something loosen in my own chest at the words. It took another 10 minutes for the retreat to become undeniable. The Vrechthi fleet, pulling away from Doran's Reach, in a formation that bore no resemblance to the disciplined advance they had arrived with. Whatever Solveth's final calculations had been, they had landed on the conclusion that continuing the engagement cost more than it could possibly gain, and for a commander who had never once needed to make that calculation before, I imagined it was not an easy thing to accept. "They're leaving the system," Laura confirmed finally. "Full withdrawal, no indication of a return course." The bridge went quiet in a different way than it had during the fight, the particular quiet of exhaustion mixed with disbelief, the kind that settles over a crew once the thing they braced for has actually passed. Henry's voice came through the calm one more time, quieter now, some of the dry humor worn thin by strain but still present underneath it. "Still here," he said. "Ships held together. Barely, but held." "Good work," I said, and I meant it more than those two words could really carry. Yilthara had not moved from the edge of the bridge throughout the entire engagement, and when I finally looked over, the ambassador's expression had shifted into something I did not have an easy word for, somewhere between awe and a kind of careful, complicated relief. "They retreated," Yilthara said quietly, as though testing whether the words were really true. "An entire Vrechthi fleet, retreating. They did the smart thing," I said. "Recognizing when a fight isn't worth finishing is not weakness. It's the one lesson that keeps commanders alive long enough to learn from their mistakes." "And your fleet," the ambassador said. "It held. It held, I agreed, because it had to. Outside our viewport, Doran's Reach continued to turn quietly beneath its distant sun, its colony lights still burning steady across the moon's surface, untouched by the engagement that had unfolded just beyond its orbit. My crew began the slow work of assessing damage, tending to strained systems, and checking in with each other in the particular way people do after coming through something they were not entirely certain they would come through at all. I sat back in my chair for the first time since the alarm had first appeared on our screens, and allowed myself, just for a moment, to feel the weight of everything that had just passed. The fight was over. What came next, I understood even then, would shape how this moment was remembered far longer than the engagement itself ever would. The hours following the withdrawal moved differently than the hours before it, slower somehow, though there was more work to do than ever. Charlotte and her engineering team moved from ship to ship, cataloging damage, patching hull breaches, and coaxing strained systems back into working order with the same patient stubbornness that had gotten us through the fight itself. Henry's gunship required the most attention, its hull scarred and several systems running on backup power, but it had held, and that was the only outcome that mattered. Down on the colony platform, the mood among the Concord population shifted slowly from disbelief into something more complicated. I watched it happen in stages over the following day, through reports Laura relayed from the surface, and through my own conversations with Yale Thara, who remained aboard our ship long after the engagement ended, seemingly unwilling to fully process what had happened, without continuing to observe the people who had made it possible. "Your crew is resting," the ambassador observed, standing near the observation window as Charlotte's team worked below on repairs. Some of them are even laughing. "That's usually a good sign," I said. "Means the fears had somewhere to go, and it went there instead of staying stuck." "I do not understand your species," Yale Thara said, not unkindly, more like someone puzzling through a problem they suspected did not have a clean answer. "You fought with such intensity, and yet you speak of it now as though it were simply another task completed." "For us, in a lot of ways, it is," I said. "That doesn't mean it didn't cost something. It means we've learned not to let the cost stop us from doing what needs doing." "What made your people this way?" the ambassador asked, and there was real curiosity behind the question, not the polite kind meant to fill silence, but the kind that comes from someone trying to understand something they have only ever heard about secondhand. I thought about how to answer that honestly, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a practiced one. "Our homeworld never made things easy for us," I said. "Long before we ever left it, we were surviving things that should have ended us 100 times over. Storms, disease, each other, more disasters than I could count if I tried. We didn't get the luxury of assuming things would go well. We learned instead how to keep going when they didn't. That habit followed us out here, into everything we do, including days like today." Yale Thara considered that for a long moment, gaze drifting back toward the window, toward Doran's Reach still turning steady and untouched beneath its sun. "Our world has always been gentler," the ambassador said quietly. "Perhaps that is why we had no answer for what approached us. We were never taught to expect this kind of difficulty." "That's not a failing," I said. "It just means you never had to build the same kind of stubbornness we did. There's nothing wrong with a gentler world. It just means when something like this comes knocking, you need people willing to stand in the gap until you can build whatever defenses you need for yourselves." "Will you stay?" the ambassador asked. "Until we are prepared to protect ourselves?" "For a while," I said. "Long enough to make sure this doesn't happen again while you're still finding your footing. After that, it's your system to protect, in whatever way suits your people best." Over the following days, word of the engagement traveled faster than I expected, carried along the same trade routes and relay stations that had brought the original distress call to us in the first place. Other convoys, other captains, began reaching out through official channels, some out of professional curiosity, some out of something closer to disbelief that needed confirming firsthand. I found myself repeating the story more times than I could count, always the same basic facts, though I noticed how the retelling shifted slightly depending on who was asking, growing a little larger with each new voice that carried it forward. Peter mentioned this to me one evening as we reviewed final repair reports together. "It's already turning into something bigger than what actually happened," he said, not with concern, but with the tired amusement of someone who had watched this pattern before. "It always does," I said. "People need stories that make sense of the things they're afraid of. We're just the raw material this time." "Does it bother you," he asked, "being turned into a story?" "No," I said after a moment's thought. "As long as somewhere underneath the exaggeration, the truth still holds. We showed up when we didn't have to. We held when the odds said we shouldn't have been able to. Everything else people add on top of that is just decoration." The Vrekthi fleet did not return to Doran's Reach, not in the days that followed, and not, as far as later reports would confirm, for a considerable time after that. Whatever calculations Solvith carried back to whatever authority oversaw that border enforcement command, they apparently concluded that this particular system was no longer worth the cost of pursuing, a conclusion that Yelthara's people would spend the coming months working to make permanent through their own strengthened defenses, aided in part by resources and knowledge my crew shared before we finally departed. On our last day in the system, Yelthara came aboard one final time, not as an anxious ambassador seeking help, but as someone standing a little steadier than the person who had first reached out across 4 relay stations in desperation. "We will remember this," the ambassador said, standing at the same observation window where our earlier conversation had taken place. "Not just what your fleet did, but what it revealed. We assumed help would look a certain way. We were wrong, and I think that mistake taught us something more valuable than the rescue itself." "What's that?" I asked. "That the appearance of strength and the truth of it are not always the same thing," Yelthara said. "We saw ships that looked worn, mismatched, unprepared for battle, and we doubted them. We were wrong to doubt, and I suspect that lesson will serve us longer than any single defense system we build. Just don't judge every ally by whether their hull looks pretty," I said. "Sometimes the ones who look like they've been through the worst are exactly the ones who know how to get you through it too." The ambassador extended a hand in the human gesture they had clearly researched before this meeting, and I shook it, marking the quiet end of an alliance that had begun in desperation and was ending, at least for now, in something closer to mutual respect. As our convoy finally broke orbit and set course back toward our original route, I stood on the bridge one last time, watching Doran's Reach shrink behind us on the display, its colony lights still burning steady, untouched, protected. My crew moved around me with the particular ease of people returning to routine after something extraordinary had passed through their lives. Charlotte already cataloging repair supplies we'd need to replace. Grace plotting our resumed course with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Henry's voice occasionally crackling through the comm with some dry remark that reminded everyone the worst of it was truly behind us. I thought about Yelthara's question from days earlier, what made humanity this way? And I understood, sitting there watching the stars shift back into their familiar patterns, that the honest answer was simpler than most people expected, and more complicated than any single sentence could really hold. We were not the strongest fleet in the galaxy. We were not the most advanced, nor the most numerous, nor even by most measures, the most feared. Not truly, not in the way legends sometimes suggested. What we were more than anything else was a species that had never been given the luxury of quitting, and somewhere along the long road from our homeworld to the stars, that lesson had simply become part of who we were, carried into every ship, every crew, every difficult decision made under pressure that would have broken easier things. Word of Doran's Reach spread further than I ever expected in the months that followed, reaching systems and species who had never had cause to think much about humanity one way or another. Some grew more cautious around us because of it, watching human vessels with a wariness that had not existed before, uncertain what exactly they were dealing with when they saw our flag on an approaching ship. Others grew curious instead, reaching out along diplomatic channels to understand a species that answered distress calls in circumstances everyone else considered lost causes. I never set out to build a reputation. None of my crew had either. We had simply answered a call that no one else was close enough to answer, and done what needed doing once we arrived, the same as we always had, on quieter deliveries and simpler routes, long before that day and long after it too. But reputations, once they take root, tend to travel further than the people who earn them ever intend, And somewhere out among the scattered systems and relay stations of that region, the story of a ragged convoy that outlasted a fleet built for easy conquest continued to grow, carried forward by every voice that told it, until it became something larger than the six of us who lived it, a small piece of the much older, much larger truth that had followed humanity out among the stars from the very beginning. We had never set out to be anyone's deadliest fleet. We had only ever set out to survive, and to help where we could along the way. It turned out, more often than not, that those two things were exactly the same.